CEO disguises himself as a factory worker. How his own team treats him is shocking. Before we get into this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories like these, make sure to subscribe, as we upload at the same time every day. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously above the factory floor as James stood near a conveyor belt that whirred with relentless speed. He was dressed in a drab uniform, 3 sizes too big, steel-toed boots that pinched his feet, and a cap pulled low to hide his face. Everything felt off. This was his own factory, and yet he felt like an intruder. The hum of the machines, the clanking of metal parts, and the distant roar of industrial fans created a backdrop that set his heart racing. Why should he be nervous? After all, James was the CEO of this very manufacturing empire, but for the first time, he was seeing it. From the ground floor, literally, he had decided to go undercover, adopting the alias Jim Rogers to see how his own workers were treated. Rumors had been circulating. Employees were overworked. Supervisors ran the place like an iron fortress, and morale had sunk to an all-time low. Whenever James asked his higher-ups if everything was okay, they'd assure him that productivity was strong, profits were up, and labor issues were nothing but gossip. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. So here he was, a hidden observer in the company he built from scratch, determined to find out the truth. His first hint that this wasn't going to be an ordinary day came the moment he reported to the front desk as a new hire. The receptionist, obviously overworked herself, barely glanced at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her desk was piled high with paperwork. She muttered, "Down the hall to the left," before coughing into her sleeve. There was no warm greeting, no orientation, nothing that matched the rosy picture his HR manager had always painted of a friendly, supportive environment. On top of that, he'd been sent the wrong uniform size and given no instructions about safety procedures, even though the factory was filled with heavy machinery and assembly lines that could easily harm someone. It struck him as odd, especially for a facility that was supposed to uphold the strictest safety standards. But he didn't say a word, not yet. He needed to keep his cover. If anyone discovered he was actually the CEO, the entire purpose of this mission would be compromised. He took a deep breath and approached the assembly line. Towering machines pressed metal sheets into specific shapes for an ongoing big contract. He noticed a sign on the wall, "Work safely or don't work here." But it was half hidden behind some old boxes. A safety poster was peeling off the wall, unreadable from all the dust. It was the kind of detail James wouldn't have believed if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. Management had claimed their safety standards were exemplary, yet here was a glaring contradiction, a subtle sign that corners might be getting cut. James's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He felt equal parts anger and nervous excitement. This was his chance to really see what was happening. And if it was truly bad, if people were being mistreated, he would fix it. He'd built this company on the principles of fairness and opportunity. At least, that was the dream. The reality might be something else entirely. He clocked in using a worn-out timecard machine that jammed on his first attempt. Another worker, a man in his early 40s with grease-stained hands, stepped forward to help. "Here, let me," the man said, giving the machine a practice nudge and sliding James's card in swiftly. "It's always been like this," he added with a weary sigh. "They keep saying they'll replace it, but we've heard that for years." His name tag read, Miguel. He offered a quick smile, but James noticed an underlying tension in his eyes, as if he'd seen too many promises go unkept. That was the first real spark that something was amiss. Why hadn't James heard about any of these issues? Why hadn't the timecard machine been replaced if it was so necessary? Surely the cost of a new machine was negligible compared to the inconvenience and frustration it caused every single day. The moment James stepped onto the production floor, he was greeted by a swirl of noises, the clang of metal parts, the hiss of pneumatic systems, and the gruff voices of supervisors barking orders. None of them seemed particularly interested in the new guy, except one tall, lean man with a perpetually stern expression named Carl. Carl was the shift supervisor, as James understood, and the look in his eyes was enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. He seemed to size James up for a moment, then pointed to a spot on the line without a word. James's station was a spot prone to repetitive strain. It involved feeding small metal components into a fast-moving press. Do it wrong, and you could lose a finger. James wondered if there was any training or briefing. Nothing came. Carl simply sneered and said, "Don't slow it down, and don't get your hands stuck in there, rookie." That single moment radiated a sense of danger. If this was how new hires were treated, he couldn't imagine what the long-term employees had to endure. Within 5 minutes, James realized how physically demanding this job was. His arms and shoulders ached from keeping up with the conveyor, and sweat dripped down his forehead. Every now and then, he'd glance around at the other workers. Some had stoic expressions, as if they'd resigned themselves to this punishing routine. Others looked exhausted, their eyes heavy. One woman, Lila, had dark circles under her eyes and was wincing slightly whenever she bent down to pick up supplies. James caught her eye once, and she tried to give him a reassuring nod. But in that tiny gesture, he saw a plea for help. It was as if she was saying, "You'll learn how it is around here soon enough." A knot formed in his stomach, and he tried to focus on the pressing machine, feeding each component at the right angle to avoid a jam or a painful accident. He kept thinking, this can't be the environment I envisioned. Was this really what day-to-day life was like in his factory? James was jolted out of his thoughts when the machine made a strange grinding sound and spat out a mangled piece of metal. He pulled back his hand instinctively. Across the line, he saw Carl eyeing him, clearly irritated. James tried to wave him over, but Carl deliberately turned his back. That was the first real test. Should James, in his undercover role, risk confrontation, or keep his head down as Miguel had suggested? He decided to speak up, quietly. "Hey, I think something's wrong with the press," he said to Miguel. Miguel merely shook his head. "Don't bother. If you mention it, he'll blame you for it. Just keep going." James's heart sank. This was exactly the scenario he feared, a culture where speaking up about safety issues was discouraged, maybe even punished. It was an undeniable red flag, and he'd encountered it within the first 2 hours of his shift. Oh, James stood at the assembly line during a brief lull, sweat trickling down his neck as the conveyor belt mercifully paused for scheduled maintenance. The so-called maintenance turned out to be a single technician who walked by, tapped a few dials, and shrugged before giving the operator a thumbs up to restart. No real inspection, no thorough checks, just a quick glance. The press that had nearly jammed earlier continued to make that unnerving grinding noise, but nobody stopped it. Glancing around, James noticed the uneasy expressions of some of the workers. They heard it too, yet no one said a thing. It was clear that the environment was built on fear of losing a job, fear of retribution from Carl or other supervisors, fear that any minor complaint would be turned against them. James felt a flicker of anger. He wanted to march up to Carl and demand a proper inspection, but he forced himself to stay quiet for now. He was here to observe, to gather evidence. He had to be sure, beyond any doubt. As if sensing James's frustration, Miguel leaned closer, speaking in a low tone that barely rose above the roar of machinery. "Listen, rookie, let me give you some advice. Keep your head down, do your time, collect your paycheck, and go home. You start making noise, and they'll find a reason to replace you." His voice carried the weight of personal experience. James felt a pang of guilt. Here was a man who likely had no idea he was speaking to the top boss. Yet Miguel seemed convinced that management did not care at all. A wave of regret washed over James. Had he really let the company grow so large and unwieldy that this kind of fear-based culture could take root? Then, as they prepared to restart, a faint cry echoed from the far side of the factory floor. James couldn't see what was going on, but he heard a supervisor shouting, "Walk it off, Gina! We're behind!" On production, a few workers glanced in that direction, then returned to their tasks, looking pained but resigned. A red flag, plain as day. An injured worker who apparently wasn't getting immediate help. This was exactly the kind of thing James had always warned against in his corporate memos and staff meetings. The hypothetical had become reality. He took a step forward, wanting to see if Gina was okay, but the conveyor belt rumbled to life. Carl returned, arms folded over his chest, glaring at James as if daring him to speak up. The unspoken warning was clear. "Don't even think about leaving your station." James ground his teeth. How many injuries went unreported? How many times did people walk it off because they feared losing their job if they complained or slowed production? He made a mental note to follow up on Gina later, though he had no idea how to do so without blowing his cover. For now, he fed more metal parts into the press, each clang and hiss a reminder that this was a world away from his corner office. With plush seating and bottled water, this was the real side of the company, and it felt like a house of cards waiting to topple. After what felt like an eternity, the buzzer sounded, indicating a short break. The tension on the floor visibly released. Workers hurried off to the break room or to grab water from an old fountain near the restrooms. James followed them, eager to get a sense of their routine. The break room was cramped, dimly lit, and smelled of microwaved leftovers and burnt coffee. A battered vending machine rattled in the corner. Workers slumped in plastic chairs, scrolling through their phones or eating hastily prepared lunches. James spotted Lila, the tired-looking woman from earlier, slowly sipping water. Her posture suggested she was in pain, though she tried to hide it. He took a seat near her, quietly asking if she was okay. She managed a half smile. "I'll live," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "My back's been bothering me for months, but there's no point in reporting it. They'll just say it's my fault for not lifting correctly, or they'll send me home without pay until I can work again." She massaged the small of her back, eyes flitting nervously around the room. "You're new, right? Trust me. Don't rock the boat." James felt a surge of protective anger. This wasn't the company he thought he'd created. He'd always envisioned an environment where employees felt safe, heard, and valued. Clearly, that vision was far from reality. Watching Lila's grimace, he wanted to tell her he was the CEO, that help was on the way, that everything would change. But he couldn't break his cover. He needed more evidence, and he needed to see just how deep this went. The next moment, the break room door slammed open. Carl stomped in, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Time's up, back on the floor," he snapped, even though the clock clearly indicated they still had 3 minutes left. No one challenged him. They simply gathered their belongings and shuffled out, shoulders slumped in resignation. James lingered a moment, glancing at the clock to confirm they were indeed leaving early. Carl shot him a glare, and James rose quickly, not wanting to provoke an incident so soon. As he walked back to the line, James realized this was more than just a few disgruntled workers. It was systemic. It was a culture of fear, abuse of power, and blatant neglect for worker well-being. The presses roared back to life, and James gritted his teeth through another grueling stretch. His hands trembled from the repetitive motion, and sweat stung his eyes. He thought about all the quarterly reports he'd read, filled with glowing remarks about operational efficiencies and minimal workplace injuries. Now, he understood that those glowing remarks were likely a smokescreen. Or maybe they were simply the filtered, half-true statements of mid-level managers more concerned with meeting quotas than actually caring for their staff. The deeper James sank into the physical and mental strain, the more determined he became. He was done trusting the polished data he received from his top brass. He wanted the raw truth, and if he had to sweat and bleed on this factory floor to get it, so be it. A sudden shout broke through his thoughts. "Press jam at Station 12! Alarms buzzed, and the conveyor slowed to a halt. Station 12 was just a few steps away, and James rushed over with Miguel. The press had crumpled a piece of metal, jamming the gears. Metal shavings littered the floor, creating a dangerous slip hazard. A co-worker named Brenda tried to dislodge the jam. The machine hissed, threatening to roar back to life at any second. James stepped forward to help, but Carl slammed a fist onto the control panel and barked, "Everybody, back off! I'll handle this." He didn't bother shutting down the machine properly. Instead, he pried at the jammed part with a metal rod. It was a reckless move, as any unexpected surge of power could crush his hand. James exchanged horrified looks with Miguel. They both knew this was a disaster waiting to happen, but no one dared to stop Carl. Finally, Carl freed the twisted metal piece and threw it on the ground with a clang. He turned to Brenda, snarling, "If this happens again, it's coming. Out of your paycheck." Brenda looked stricken, tears welling up, but she nodded in silence. James's jaw tightened. This was not a fluke accident, but a symptom of a bigger issue: outdated machinery, ignored maintenance, and a management style that relied on threats rather than solutions. Carl didn't check if the jam caused any damage to the press, nor did he verify that the station was safe to resume work. He simply started the conveyor again, and the line lurched into motion. This was exactly the scenario those protocols were meant to address. The company had procedures to reject faulty supplies and hold suppliers accountable. Yet here, on the factory floor, it seemed easier for management to blame the workers than to fix the actual problem. A question nagged at him. Where was Tony, the floor manager? Why was Carl running around unchecked, practically acting like a dictator? As if on cue, Tony emerged from a side door, talking on his phone. His expression shifted when he saw the chaos. Instead of stepping in to support Jade or to question the defective materials, Tony pinned the blame on the workers as well. Carl's right, Tony said, shaking his head at Jade. We can't afford these delays. If you can't handle it, I'll assign someone who can. Jade's shoulders sagged, and she stepped aside, letting Tony himself feed a piece of metal into the press. Of course, it jammed almost immediately. Tony kicked the machine in frustration, then turned to Carl. Sort this out. I don't have time to babysit. James exchanged a knowing glance with Miguel. This was a leadership vacuum at its worst. No one taking responsibility. No one bothering to escalate the supplier issue or pause production for a real fix. Instead, they were content to run the machines half broken, pushing the workers to their limits. It was a small moment that revealed the deeper systemic failure. The entire management chain seemed content to patch holes and place blame, rather than implementing real solutions. James found himself wondering just how many levels of bureaucracy existed between him and these floor managers, each level carefully wrapping the truth in corporate spin. He clenched his fists at his sides, determined to see more, to gather enough evidence that no one could deny. The question was, how long could he stand by without intervening? A startling metallic crash snapped James back to the present. Jade, hands trembling, had dropped a stack of metal sheets. Carl spun around, the veins in his neck bulging. You clumsy, he began, cursing under his breath. In that moment, James noticed Lila across the aisle, wincing but rushing to help Jade pick up the scattered sheets. That small gesture of solidarity struck James like an arrow to the heart. The workers might be bound by fear, but they still had each other's backs in small ways. It was all they could do in the face of management's hostility. James wanted to run over, to assist Jade himself, but he also knew any extra attention might put them both under more scrutiny. Instead, he continued feeding parts into his press, eyes scanning the scene, heart heavy with indignation. Hours later, they all trudged to the break room for lunch. Jade looked hollow-eyed, and Lila moved stiffly, clutching her side. Even Miguel seemed more worn out than before. The group sat together at one battered table, the mood heavy. The only sounds were the scraping of plastic forks against cheap takeout containers and the flickering overhead lights. Finally, James decided to speak, carefully choosing his words so as not to break his cover, but to encourage them to open up. So, is it always like this? He asked, trying to sound casual. Jade shot him a dark look. You're lucky. You haven't seen the half of it, she muttered, casting a quick glance at the door, as if checking for eavesdroppers. Wait until Tony decides he's bored. He'll stroll through the floor, pick someone at random, and unleash on them. It's like he gets off on it. Lila nodded, keeping her voice low. Carl's bad, but Tony's worse. He's the floor manager. After all, Carl's just following his lead. She shifted in her seat, grimacing at the movement. They say, if you complain to HR, it doesn't matter. HR reports to Tony, so you can guess how that goes. Miguel sighed, rubbing a calloused hand across his face. Been here 12 years. Seen a lot of good people come and go. Most of the ones who stay either shut up and deal with it or end up like me, counting the days until retirement. His tone was resigned, and James felt a pang of responsibility. This was his company, and good people were suffering under a toxic regime. But he needed a clearer picture of Tony's role, of how deeply this culture was ingrained, and how far the abuse went. While they talked, James noticed a large bulletin board on the wall, covered in company announcements. One of them proudly showcased a Worker of the Month program, with Tony's signature at the bottom. It promised recognition and a small bonus. Yet the slot for the current month was empty, and last month's winner was Carl. Ironically, James shook his head in disbelief. The entire system seemed rigged to reward the very behavior that was destroying morale. The break ended far too soon, with Tony himself opening the door and barking, "Let's go! Let's go! This isn't a spa day." Everyone rose, trashing their half-eaten meals and heading back to the line. The atmosphere was tense, a collective dread settling over them as they prepared for more humiliation and potential danger. As the day wore on, the defective metal kept causing jams, slowing production further. Carl's patience thinned to a razor's edge. He snapped at anyone within earshot, his voice echoing across the concrete walls. Tony appeared sporadically, each time berating workers for the slow pace, or joking sarcastically about finding replacements who know how to work. By mid-afternoon, an older man named Gary collapsed from the heat and the pressure, though the temperature wasn't even that high. Lila ran to his side, fanning him with a clipboard. Instead of calling medical, Tony scowled. "We don't have time for this." Only when Gary didn't regain consciousness did Tony bark at someone to fetch a first aid responder. James's heart hammered in his chest. This was beyond a toxic environment. It was downright abusive. He clenched his jaw, controlling the urge to reveal himself right then and there, to shout that he was the CEO and that Tony had no right to treat people this way. But he held back. He had to be strategic, otherwise the culprits would just spin the narrative and continue abusing people once the initial shock wore off. Shortly after Gary was taken to the infirmary, a hush fell over the line. Carl stalked up to James, eyes narrowing as if he was zeroing in on a prey. "You!" he barked. "You're the new guy. Why are you so slow today? You're messing up the flow." James blinked, trying to keep his voice steady. "The press keeps jamming. I'm feeding it at the correct rate." Carl's lips curled into a sneer. "Don't talk back to me. You're replaceable. Don't forget that." He shoved a clipboard into James's chest, forcing him to sign off on the quota sheet. As he did, James noticed the numbers were inflated compared to what they'd actually produced. "What's this?" James murmured, careful not to sound accusatory. Carl leaned in, voice dripping with intimidation. "You sign it, or you're out. Those are the numbers Tony wants to see. We don't argue with the chain of command." A spark of adrenaline shot through James. This was blatant fraud, reporting higher production numbers to make themselves look good, all at the expense of workers who were being pushed to the brink. He momentarily considered refusing, but the risk of blowing his cover was too great. Reluctantly, he scribbled an illegible signature as Jim Rogers. Carl snatched the clipboard and marched off, apparently satisfied. James's heart pounded as he returned to the machine, feeding pieces with renewed frustration. That single demand to falsify records showed just how corrupt this chain of command had become. It was more than just a harsh management style. It was a web of lies designed to protect those at the top and squeeze every ounce of sweat out of those at the bottom. He caught Miguel's eye, and the older man gave him a look that said, "Just survive." James felt a surge of conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt sorry for these workers, including Miguel, who had clearly given up hope. On the other hand, he was furious at himself for not having uncovered this sooner. If only he had done random inspections, or if only he had insisted on talking directly to line workers more frequently. The entire system was broken, and it was his responsibility to fix it. But he needed a moment, a catalyst, something that would expose these tyrants in front of everyone. Only then could real change begin. When the shift ended, James's body felt like it had been through a gauntlet. His back ached, his arms hurt, and his head throbbed from the constant barrage of machinery and shouting. The image of Gary collapsing still haunted him, along with the worried look on Lila's face as she tried to help him. He wanted to check on Gary, but Carl quickly ushered everyone out, making it clear that lingering was not allowed. "We close. The floor for cleaning," he lied, even though the nighttime crew was just arriving. James could see how spooked the other workers were by Gary's incident. This was no environment for them to thrive in. It was merely a place where they punched in, endured abuse, and prayed they'd make it through the day without injury or reprimand. James left with the same burning anger he'd felt the day before, multiplied tenfold. Night came, and James couldn't sleep. He sat in his living room with the lights dimmed, replaying the day's events in his mind. Every detail was etched into his memory. The look of terror in Jade's eyes, the bitterness in Lila's voice, the resignation in Miguel's shrug. He recalled Tony's dismissive tone, Carl's bullying, and the constant humming of failing machinery. He recognized that a moment of confrontation was coming soon, whether he liked it or not. Eventually, something would happen. Another injury, another jam, another meltdown, and James would be forced to step in, revealing who he was. He worried that if he waited too long, more workers would suffer. Yet if he acted too soon, he might not gather enough evidence to justify a sweeping overhaul and hold Tony and Carl fully accountable. He had to be prepared for the moment when everything came to a head. A restless sleep finally claimed him, and the next morning, he woke up with a surge of resolve. This was the day he'd push just a little bit harder, see if he could draw Tony or Carl into making even bigger mistakes. Out in the open, he wanted other witnesses to see it, so there would be no denying what was happening. He headed to the factory, determined to step closer to a confrontation that was beginning to feel inevitable. James arrived, earlier than usual, stepping into the partially lit factory floor, where a few morning shift workers milled about. To his surprise, Tony was already there, leaning against a railing on the second-floor walkway, overlooking the main floor. He spotted James and gave a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Early bird, huh?" Tony shouted down, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. James nodded, playing the meek rookie. Tony strolled down the staircase, his footsteps echoing on the metal steps. "I hear you've been having trouble on the line. Don't think I haven't noticed," he said, his tone somewhere between threatening and condescending. James kept his voice steady. "Just doing my best," Tony scoffed. "Your best better. Improve. Quotas are going up, not down, and we're already behind." He circled James like a predator, as if assessing whether he was worth keeping around. Finally, he leaned in, eyes piercing. "This place doesn't run on excuses. We need results." James stared back, feigning nervous compliance. Inside, though, he was taking mental notes. Tony was every bit the tyrant he'd been warned about, the type who'd do anything to maintain his power. James calmly said, "Understood." Tony nodded slowly and walked off, leaving James with the unsettling feeling that a storm was about to break. The shift began, and almost immediately, a glitch in the conveyor chain caused a backup. Workers scrambled to sort out the metal pieces, and Jade, still shaken from the day before, tried to keep up. Lila was carefully checking each part for defects, a slow process that irritated Carl. He marched up to Lila, practically hissing, "Speed! It up! We can't babysit every single piece!" Lila grimaced, pain etched on her face, but she quickened her pace anyway. James watched from his station, his fury building. He told himself to be patient. This was exactly the kind of moment that would reveal the rot to everyone. Then it happened. A loud shriek pierced the air. Lila had misjudged the timing and caught her finger in the conveyor clamp, ripping her glove and possibly injuring her hand. She yanked it free, tears streaming down her face. The machine halted for a moment. Workers froze, eyes darting to see if Carl or Tony would help. For a second, James thought Carl might show concern, but Carl's response was horrifying. "What? Did I tell you about slowing down? That's your own fault." Lila cradled her hand, blood soaking through the glove, eyes wide with shock and pain. James felt his stomach churn. This was it. Beyond the point of no return. He couldn't watch these people suffer any longer. Carl's words echoed in the sudden hush, his cruelty on full display. James let go of his neutral facade. He rushed over to Lila, ignoring Carl's angry protest. "We need first aid, now!" James shouted, scanning for a kit. Carl grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away, and snarled, "She can deal with it herself. We're behind schedule." That was the last straw. James whirled around, shoving Carl's hand off him with more force than he intended. Carl staggered back, eyes blazing. James's heart pounded as he turned to face the gathered workers. All eyes were on him now. He locked eyes with Tony, who stood at the other end of the floor, arms crossed, looking furious. Time seemed to slow. This was the moment James had anticipated, the first real confrontation. He took a deep breath, mustering the courage to speak. If he came clean about who he was right here, it would be a bombshell that no one could ignore. But a quick glance at Lila's bleeding hand made him realize he couldn't waste time with theatrics. "Get us some help," he demanded, pointing to a pair of nearby workers who promptly rushed off to find the first aid kit. Tony stormed over, face contorted with anger. "Who do you think you are? Giving orders on my floor?" he bellowed. James squared his shoulders, preparing to say something that would change the course of everything. Yet before he could speak, Tony barked at two security guards who had appeared at the sound of commotion. "Get this troublemaker out of here. He's interfering with production." The guards advanced, and James felt a moment of panic. This wasn't just a minor disagreement. Tony was clearly willing to have him removed by force. Would this ruin everything? Should he reveal his identity now, or was there a better moment coming? He looked around at the workers, saw their fear, their hopelessness. Then he saw Lila, cradling her injured hand, tears streaming down her cheeks, fighting through pain because she knew complaining would do no good. That sight decided it for him. Enough was enough. He opened his mouth to speak, feeling words tumble out in a voice, louder than he'd intended. "Don't touch me. I'm James Radcliffe, the CEO of this entire operation, and you're all done." A collective gasp spread across the factory floor. The guards froze mid-step, looking bewildered. Tony's mouth fell open, and Carl's face went ashen. The moment stretched like an eternity. James's heart hammered as he locked eyes with Tony. The entire floor had gone silent, the roar of machinery now replaced by the thunder of pulses in every worker's ears. This was the crescendo he dreaded and anticipated. Everything would change from here on out, for better or worse. Tony tried to regain control, sputtering, "You're lying!" But the panic in his eyes betrayed him. The assembled workers could see who held the real power now. James inhaled deeply, his voice ringing with finality. "Get that woman to a hospital immediately, or I'll make sure you're held personally responsible for everything that happens next." A flurry of movement followed. Some workers stepped forward to help Lila. Others simply gawked, trying to process the bombshell revelation. Tony opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, at a loss for words. Carl backed away slowly, sweat beading on his forehead. "Do it now," James roared, pointing to Lila. Two workers carefully escorted her off the floor, presumably toward the infirmary, or maybe even an actual medical facility. With Lila's immediate crisis being addressed, James pivoted back to Tony and Carl, an unmistakable fire in his eyes. "I came here undercover because I suspected things weren't right. You've just shown me how bad it is." Tony tried to sputter out some denial, but James silenced him with a glare. "I've seen enough. I've heard enough. You two have been intimidating workers, pushing them beyond safe limits, and covering up the truth. This ends now." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the onlooking crowd of workers. Some looked terrified, others cautiously hopeful. Carl tried to slink away, but James caught sight of him. "Where do you think you're going?" James's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Carl froze, his posture tense, every fiber of his being screaming that he wanted to flee. The security guards exchanged confused glances, unsure who to follow, the floor manager or the CEO. James took one step forward, eyes pinned on Carl. "You're done," he repeated, the finality in his tone leaving no room for argument. "Pack your things, if you've got any sense left." Tony suddenly found his voice, though it came out shaky. "You can't just come in here and—" James raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Don't even try. I have enough evidence to fire you on the spot. Actually, consider it done." The raw power of the confrontation was palpable. Tony opened and closed his mouth, desperation flashing across his features. He looked around, as if searching for an ally, but found none. Even the security guards took a step back, making it clear they wouldn't stand against the CEO. Versailles was no place to hide. The workers were riveted, watching a tyrant lose his footing. James took in a steadying breath. He could see the fear in Tony's eyes. "You and Carl are finished here. I'll deal with HR and the legal department personally to ensure it's immediate," James declared, voice shaking only slightly from the adrenaline coursing through him. Then he turned, addressing the stunned crowd of workers. "As for the rest of you, I'm sorry. I'm sorry this is the environment you've had to endure. I promise you, it changes today. Anyone else who's been complicit in this abuse, step forward now, or you'll be found out later." The hush that followed was deafening. No one moved, though a few eyes darted nervously around. Tony looked like he wanted to protest, but the weight of James's revelation and authority left him. Speechless, James focused on the immediate crisis, Lila's injury. "Is she okay? Someone fill me in," he said, snapping the workers out of their collective stupor. A woman named Dana stepped forward, trembling. "They took her to the hospital. It looked bad," she managed to say, her voice quivering. James nodded, forcing down the lump in his throat. He wanted to go after Lila himself, but he knew he had to settle things here first. "All right. Everyone else, stand by. We're shutting down the line for a full inspection, effective now." Murmurs of disbelief spread through the group. For the first time, they saw a glimmer of hope, someone at the top actually willing to halt production for safety and to root out corruption. "That's insane," Tony finally erupted, desperation making him bold. "We'll miss our quotas, lose our contracts." James shot him a look of utter disdain. "Is that all you care about? Meeting quotas while people get hurt?" He shook his head in disgust, stepping closer to Tony. "If there are financial consequences, that's on me. I'll handle them, not you. And you," he jabbed a finger at Carl, "start writing your resignation letter, assuming you can write." A few workers couldn't resist letting out a muted chuckle, the tension lifting slightly. Carl looked as if he might pass out from shame or fury, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The confrontation was loud, messy, and public, exactly what James had hoped to avoid, but now realized was inevitable. And maybe it was exactly what was needed, a cleansing shock to the system. He could almost feel the air crackling with long-suppressed emotion, as if years of frustration and fear were finally being released. Some workers looked jubilant, others simply stunned. The hush broke into hushed whispers as they realized that their tyrants had been dethroned. James inhaled, trying to steady himself. He was aware that a million questions would come at him next, from the media, from shareholders, from board members. But in this moment, all that mattered was that justice had finally broken through the chokehold of toxic management. A chaotic hour followed. Tony and Carl were practically frog-marched to the main office, where James demanded they hand over any company property and clear out their lockers. HR staff arrived, looking disoriented and unsure of how to proceed. Some tried to placate Tony, but James quickly shut that down. "He's fired. Immediately. Any severance or further compensation will be reviewed by our legal team." Tony glared, but he was cornered. Carl let out a string of curses under his breath, but it was all bluster. He too was stripped of his position. Security no longer answered to Tony, and that final power shift sealed their fate. They were asked to leave the premises under watch. Word spread through the factory like wildfire. The tyrants were gone. James noticed how quickly the atmosphere began to lighten, despite the tension of the unknown. It was as if a dark cloud had been lifted. Some workers even gave him hesitant smiles, as if to say thank you, though they were still reeling from the shock that Jim Rogers was actually James Radcliffe, the CEO. James, for his part, felt an odd mixture of relief and responsibility. He knew that removing Tony and Carl was only the first step. Systemic change would take time, effort, and a major reshuffling of management practices. But for now, he'd taken the necessary leap. He gathered everyone on the factory floor, shutting down the machines for a mandatory all-hands meeting. A hush fell as he stood before them, still clad in the oil-stained uniform. "I'm sure you all have questions," he began, voice echoing across the silent space. "I promise I'll answer them. But first, I want you to know that I've seen what goes on here. I've seen how you're treated, how safety is neglected, how your concerns are dismissed. That ends now. I won't stand for it." A ripple of amazement spread through the crowd. Some exchanged incredulous looks. They'd heard promises from higher-ups before, but never from someone who had just personally witnessed their struggles. On the production line, James continued, his own anger tempered by genuine concern. "Today, we're halting production for a thorough audit of equipment, of working conditions, and of managerial conduct. Anyone who has a complaint or an idea for improvement, you can come to me directly or to the interim manager I'll be appointing. And yes, let me say that again, I'll be here. I'm not going to just walk away and let someone else deal with this. I intend to stay on site, day in and day out, until I'm sure things are as they should be." Some workers looked skeptical, but many seemed cautiously optimistic. The undercurrent of hope was a tangible force, and James could sense the emotional weight of years of oppression starting to lift from their shoulders. Miguel stepped forward, clearing his throat. "So, is Tony really gone?" he asked, voice trembling with pent-up relief. James nodded. "Yes, Tony and Carl both, effective immediately." The faintest of smiles touched Miguel's lips. A few other employees exhaled audibly, as if they'd been holding their breath for ages. James addressed the crowd again. "I won't lie to you. This is going to be a rough patch. We might miss some deliveries. We might lose some money in the short term. But I'd rather lose money than lose the trust and well-being of the people who actually make this company run." Suddenly, Jade, who had suffered so much verbal abuse, raised her hand tentatively. What about Lila and Gary? Are they going to be okay? She spoke with concern etched on her features. James nodded gravely. I've already instructed HR to give them full medical support. No one will lose pay over this. I want them to recover fully. A wave of relief swept over the group. Jade clutched her chest, fighting back tears of gratitude. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one for them. James glanced toward the factory entrance, wondering if Lila had gotten the emergency care she needed. He silently vowed to visit her in the hospital as soon as possible. The meeting ended on a tense but hopeful note. James told everyone to take the rest of the day off with pay, instructing them to return tomorrow ready to help him rebuild. In hushed tones, they scattered, gathering their personal belongings. Some lingered to quietly thank him. Others simply looked on in disbelief. James knew he'd earned a measure of respect by working alongside them undercover, but trust would take longer. After all, they'd been burned before by empty corporate promises. Still, he couldn't help but feel a spark of optimism that real change was finally within reach. After the workers departed, James remained. Behind in the quiet, cavernous factory, the machines were still, the air eerily calm, and the usual roar of the conveyor belts replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights. He walked slowly down the aisles, taking in the stark reality of each workstation. Half-broken tools, outdated safety posters, worn-out tape-marking walkways. This place had so much potential, yet it had become a den of intimidation and neglect. His footsteps echoed, each step a reminder that he had a colossal responsibility to set things right. Outside, he spotted his personal driver waiting near the front gate, a contrast to the usual bus rides or carpools the workers relied on. James waved him off, choosing instead to walk to his car parked in the workers' lot, exactly where Jim Rogers would have parked. That walk felt symbolic. He was determined to stay on the same level as his employees, to experience the day-to-day challenges they faced, whether it was a long trek across the parking lot or dealing with broken vending machines. He passed a few smaller offices, poking his head in to see if anything else was amiss. One office was stacked with unfiled complaints and forms, a physical testament to how many issues had gone ignored. James couldn't believe how oblivious he'd been, trusting that his management team would handle these matters appropriately. He eventually reached his old sedan, the one he'd used for this undercover stint. The interior smelled of stale coffee and sweat, a stark difference from the luxury car he usually rode in. As he sank into the driver's seat, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot, his hair disheveled. Yet, for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose. He was no longer just a figurehead reading quarterly reports. He was a CEO who had seen the unvarnished truth, who had witnessed the heartbreak and the bravery of his workers firsthand. He could never go back to business as usual. Turning the ignition, he pulled out of the lot. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from board members and executives who had caught wind of the day's dramatic events. James ignored them. For the moment, he needed a second to gather his thoughts, to mentally compose the narrative he'd share with the board and the public. That narrative would include Tony's and Carl's immediate dismissals, the halting of production for a safety audit, and the promise of a revamped culture that put employees' well-being at the forefront. He knew it would ruffle feathers and possibly spook investors, but he no longer cared about short-term panic. This was about the soul of his company. Before heading home, James made one more stop, a small local hospital. He needed to check on Lila. After a few minutes of navigating the hospital's corridors, he found her room. She was lying in bed, hand bandaged, eyes closed. A nurse stepped out, raising an eyebrow at James's grimy uniform. He quietly introduced himself by his real name and explained the situation, though he left out the CEO part. The nurse nodded, opening the door a crack. Lila stirred, blinking rapidly as she noticed James. For a moment, confusion flashed across her face. Then realization dawned. "You," she whispered hoarsely. "Why are you here?" James pulled up a chair, his voice soft. "I had to make sure you were okay." Lila stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, eyes moist with unspoken gratitude. "I'll manage," she said, her tone braver than her fragile state suggested. "They said the injury's not permanent, but it'll take time to heal." James clenched his jaw. "I'm so sorry. None of this should have happened." Lila gave a shaky laugh. "You're the first person from management who's ever said that." She paused, glancing at the uniform again. So, what happens now? Her eyes betrayed a deep fear that once she recovered, she might return to the same oppressive environment, if she even had a job to return to. James gently reached out, stopping short of taking her uninjured hand, not wanting to overstep. I promise you, things will change. Tony and Carl, they're gone, and I'll be there personally to make sure no one else tries what they did. Lila's eyes widened. She looked on the verge of tears, perhaps from relief or from the shock of everything happening so fast. You really did that? She asked, her voice trembling. James simply nodded. Yes, and I'm not done. I'm going to need your help, and the help of every worker who has been mistreated. I need your voices, your stories, so we can fix this. Place from the ground up. A tear slipped down Lila's cheek. She bit her lip to keep her emotions in check, then smiled faintly. Thank you, she said. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken hopes. James sat with her a while longer, talking softly, promising that her job was secure, that her medical bills would be covered, that no one would punish her for the accident. Each reassurance seemed to ease her tension, as if a massive burden was lifting off her shoulders. Eventually, the nurse returned, urging James to let Lila rest. As he stood up to leave, Lila murmured, I'll hold you to your word. James nodded solemnly. You have every right to. By the time James finally got home, night had fallen. He glanced at his phone, which was still buzzing with messages. Sinking into his couch, he exhaled a long breath, letting the events of the day wash over him. He had done it, confronted the worst offenders, halted production, and set a new course for the factory. But tomorrow would bring new challenges, explaining his actions to the board, justifying the cost of shutting down production, dealing with possible legal repercussions if Tony or Carl tried to fight their termination. Yet in the quiet darkness of his living room, he felt a strange sense of peace. He'd done the right thing, even if it meant shaking up the entire company. Early the next morning, he convened an emergency meeting with his top executives. Some arrived with expressions of shock, others with fury, and a few with cautious approval. James laid out the entire story, his undercover work, the rampant abuses he witnessed, the injuries, the intimidation, and finally, the public dismissal of Tony and Carl. He made it clear that anyone who valued short-term profits over basic, human decency had no place in his organization. A tense silence followed his announcement. One or two executives protested, citing financial concerns, but James shut them down. I'd rather face a temporary loss than a permanent stain on our reputation, he said firmly. And more importantly, I refuse to run a company that treats its employees like expendable cogs in a machine. By the end of the meeting, some executives stormed out, others pledged their support, and a few remained visibly conflicted. But James felt emboldened. He was forging a new path, and anyone unwilling to walk it with him could leave. He immediately implemented the safety audit, hiring an outside firm to ensure impartiality. He also set up an anonymous hotline for workers to report grievances, bypassing any middle managers who might try to suppress complaints. Word spread fast, and within days, the hotline was flooded with stories of abuse, mismanagement, and near miss, accidents that had never been documented. James spent hours reading them, each one a gut punch. But the more he learned, the more resolute he became. On the second day of the shutdown, James returned to the factory. This time, he wore a clean but simple outfit. No suit, but also not the grimy disguise of a floor worker. He greeted employees at the gate as they arrived. Some were unsure why they were coming if the machines were off, but he invited them in for meetings, group discussions, and training sessions on safety protocols. They spent the day going over the new guidelines, brainstorming improvements, and building a sense of community that had long been missing. Workers were hesitant at first, but as they saw how seriously James was taking their input, they began to open up. They shared stories of broken machinery, shady overtime practices, and the heartbreak of seeing colleagues injured or fired for minor mistakes. By the end of that day, a cautious optimism was brewing. James could see it in the way people talked to each other, how they volunteered ideas, how they even laughed a little. Lila came by as well, her hand bandaged, but her spirit noticeably brighter. She sat in on a session, receiving gentle applause from her co-workers, who were glad to see her on the mend. The scene brought tears to James's eyes. This was what he wanted the company to be, a place of respect, safety, and mutual support. When the factory finally resumed production a week later, it was with a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, there were still kinks to work out. The new managers James appointed were learning on the job, and not every policy changed overnight. But the oppressive cloud was gone. Workers walked in with their heads held high, unafraid to speak up if they spotted a hazard. And James made sure to be there regularly, not just in his office, but on the floor, talking to employees, learning their names, checking on their well-being. He set up a small break area with comfortable chairs and fresh snacks, a far cry from the dreary hole they'd used before. It was a symbolic gesture, but it meant something to people. They could see he was trying. One afternoon, he gathered everyone together for an update. They stood by the idle machines, forming a loose circle around him. "I won't pretend we can fix everything overnight," he began, his voice carrying across the open space. "But I promise you, we're on the right track. We have new safety measures, a new chain of command, and we'll keep improving. If anyone has any concerns or ideas, my door is always open, literally. And for those of you who step up to help make this place better, there will be opportunities for advancement. I believe in promoting from within, in rewarding those who truly care about their work and their colleagues." A wave of soft applause echoed through the space. James scanned the crowd, catching the eyes of Miguel, Jade, Leela, and many others he'd come to know. Their smiles warmed him, fueling his determination to make permanent changes. Over time, the production rate rebounded. Despite losing Tony and Carl, the lines ran smoother than before, mainly because workers were no longer afraid to point out problems early. Morale improved, and so did efficiency, an unexpected yet welcome development. James was careful to credit the workers themselves for this turnaround. He knew that trust was earned slowly, and he wanted them to realize their power. New leaders emerged from the ranks, people like Jade, who showed remarkable attention to detail, or Lila, who, despite her injury, demonstrated empathy and dedication that others naturally gravitated toward. James quietly made plans to train and promote these individuals, forging a new leadership base grounded in respect rather than fear. A few weeks after the big showdown, James arranged a small ceremony on the factory floor. He presented safety, awards to those who had spoken up about hazards, acknowledging their courage. Lila, bandages now removed from her healing hand, stood beside him and shared her story, prompting a wave of compassion and unity among the workforce. She received a standing ovation. James then announced a revised Worker of the Month program, one that actually rewarded genuine contributions, with input from fellow employees rather than decisions made behind closed doors by upper management. Applause roared through the factory, so loud that some said it was louder than the machines themselves. By the time the sun set that day, James found himself lingering on the factory floor, alone except for the soft hum of the overhead lights. He couldn't believe the transformation that had begun. There was still a long road ahead, but the most vital change had already taken place. The workers knew they mattered. They knew someone at the top actually cared. Leaning against a railing overlooking the production line, much like Tony once did, he reflected on how close he had come to never discovering the toxic underbelly of his own empire. If not for a hunch and a willingness to get his hands dirty, he might still be in his penthouse office, reading inflated reports and believing everything was fine. He gazed down at the idle machinery. In the coming days, these stations would be manned by people who no longer had to fear for their safety or endure verbal abuse just to earn a living. He remembered the look on Carl's face when he was fired in front of everyone, a combination of shock, rage, and fear. Tony's arrogant swagger had crumbled too, revealing the coward beneath. It hadn't been a pleasant scene, but it was necessary. A public reckoning that proved no one was untouchable. The memory of that confrontation still sent a surge of adrenaline through James's veins. Weeks turned into months. Profits dipped initially due to the downtime and the cost of new equipment and training programs. The board grumbled, and some shareholders questioned James's leadership. Yet he held firm, reminding them that a stable, happy workforce was far more valuable in the long run than a momentary spike in the quarterly report. Slowly, as word spread that Reynolds Manufacturing was cleaning house, new opportunities arose. Vendors, with a focus on ethical sourcing, wanted to partner. Job applicants increased, and the local community applauded the positive changes. The initial financial hit began to rebound and even surpass previous levels, all because the people on the floor were motivated, respected, and safe. James had become a fixture on the factory floor, ditching his old corner office ways. He still attended board meetings, still negotiated with big clients, but he made sure to spend time chatting with workers daily, forging genuine relationships. He knew their names, learned about their families, shared jokes, and offered a compassionate ear. Lila eventually returned to full duty, her hand mostly healed. She took on a semi-supervisory role, ensuring that safety protocols were consistently followed. Jade became a leading trainer for new hires, championing the importance of diligence and patience. Miguel, once so resigned, found a renewed sense of purpose. He discovered he had a knack for mentoring younger workers, sharing tips on how to handle the more challenging tasks without risking injury. The day finally came when James decided it was time to give a more formal speech to all employees, not just factory workers, but administrative staff, sales teams, and anyone else under the Reynolds Manufacturing umbrella. He booked a large auditorium in the city, inviting everyone to attend either in person or virtually. Standing on stage in casual attire, no expensive suit, he spoke from the heart about what he'd witnessed, what he'd learned, and the company's new direction. He spared no detail about the old regime's toxicity, nor did he shy away from acknowledging his own negligence in letting it happen. The reaction was electrifying. Employees cheered, some even cried. It felt like a watershed moment, the unveiling of a new culture that placed people above profits and honesty above complacency. Months later, a simple plaque appeared in the factory's break room. It read, "Dedicated to every worker who speaks up. Thank you for making us stronger." James had insisted on it, despite some marketing advisors calling it too sentimental. To him, it was a daily reminder that the backbone of Reynolds Manufacturing was its people. Without them, no spreadsheet, no quarterly result, no corporate success story mattered. It also stood as a monument to the day he personally saw how badly things could go wrong, and how essential it was to remain vigilant. Although the memory of Carl's sneers and Tony's bullying lingered, they were now part of a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen when complacency and greed took over. The new management team, composed of both trusted veterans and fresh faces, worked tirelessly to ensure that no one else would ever have to endure that kind of oppression. Whenever James overheard a new hire ask an old-timer, "Is it really true the CEO once worked undercover on the line?" he'd smile and think about the sweat-soaked uniform and the rattling time-card machine. Yes, it was true, and it was the turning point that saved the company's soul. Looking back, James couldn't help but feel gratitude for the path he'd taken. It was unconventional, messy, and risky, but it exposed a side of his empire he never would have seen from the top floor. If he'd remained insulated by layers of management, trusting their glossy reports, countless workers would still be suffering. If he'd intervened too delicately, Tony and Carl might have slipped away, blaming a few scapegoats without real change taking place. Instead, in one raw, loud, public showdown, James had torn down the facade and started anew. It wasn't just a victory for the employees, it was a personal evolution for James as well, who realized that true leadership involved getting his hands dirty, confronting uncomfortable truths, and standing up for those without power. In the end, the shock of seeing how his own team treated him under disguise was the best wake-up call he could have received. The revelations were indeed shocking, but the transformation that followed was equally profound. The factory thrived under a new culture of respect, openness, and shared responsibility. And James, he was no longer just a figurehead CEO in a fancy suit. He was a leader who'd walked the factory floor in steel-toed boots and a battered uniform, fighting side by side with his people to reclaim the heart of the company he'd built from the ground up.